Congratulations, guys. You finally made it to the final video of the first chapter from Best Medicine of Medical School Histology. So that's progress, right? Reward yourself a little bit, take it easy. All right, so this little video is actually going to be about epithelial tissue as a whole, as a group of cells. So far, what we have learned, or what we have basically studied or noticed or looked at, is that we looked at single cells, isolated cells on their own, right? We've only looked at the apical size, the lateral size, and the basal size of the cells, but we haven't looked at them as a tissue itself. And we obviously also, if you had noticed, have missed out on microscopic slides a lot, right? So this video is actually going to be full of microscopic slides, and we're going to be looking at different types of epithelium and their cells. And yeah, so fasten your seatbelts and let's go. So, in the very first video, I taught you that epithelial tissue is actually a group of aggregated epithelial cells. So all of those cells are actually collected with each other. Now, epithelial tissue can either be of two types. Number one, usually is of two types, which is number one, simple epithelium, which would mean that there's only a single layer of cells, right? A single layer of cells is called a simple epithelium, while more than one layer of cells is actually called a stratified epithelium, right? So simple epithelium would be one layer of cells, while stratified epithelium would be an epithelium that has more than one layer of cells. Now, those cells can have different types of shapes, right? They can either be flattened, completely flattened, as if they're pressed from the top and they've been completely squeezed into these flat discs. And we call this shape squamous. Or they could be sort of even from all sides, and we call them cuboidal. Or they could exist as large columns, which is obviously called columnar. So a single layer of flattened cells is called simple squamous epithelium, while an epithelium which has a single layer of cuboidal cells would be called cuboidal epithelium, and an epithelium which has a single layer of large column-like cells is called columnar epithelium. Likewise, more than one layer of flattened cells would be called stratified squamous, and more than one layer of cuboidal cells would be called stratified cuboidal, and more than one layer of columnar epithelium would be called stratified columnar, right? And stratified columnar is actually really rare. So I'll give you some examples of this as well. Just hold on a minute. And then the other two types are kind of like isolated on their own because they're a little bit different. This one is called pseudo-stratified epithelium. It's pseudo-stratified because it appears as though it is stratified. Pseudo would mean a sham, right? So stratified, even it appears as though it is stratified, but it's actually not. And this is pseudo-stratified columnar epithelium. So there's columnar cells that appear as though they are stratified, but actually are not. And it's actually present, we looked at it, in the respiratory tract. The respiratory epithelium is actually this kind of epithelium. We'll actually look at some microscopic slide images in just a bit. Next up, we have transitional epithelium. What does transitional epithelium mean? Well, transition would mean changing from one state to another. And transitional epithelium, likewise, would be one type of cells to next type of cells to another type of cells in the same epithelium. So maybe it has some cuboidal cells, and on top of that, it maybe has some giant cells and some columnar cells. So that's an example of a transitional epithelium that has different layers of different types of cells in that epithelium. Example of this is actually in the urinary tract, and we'll look at the example on a microscopic slide in just a bit. So that pretty much sums up this diagram. Now let's head over to our neat notes where I've got the pictures that I actually compiled for you guys to show you these little images that I've got of different types of epithelium. So first of all, of course, we have the simple squamous epithelium. Simple would mean a single layer, and squamous would mean flattened cells. So a simple squamous epithelium is usually present in the blood vessel endothelium, very important, high yield. All the blood vessel epithelium, which is then called the endothelium. Blood vessel epithelium is called the endothelium. And endothelium contains simple squamous cells lining the inside of blood vessels everywhere, right? Even in the heart. And then we have pleura. You know, remember pleura from the very first video? Pleura is also simple squamous. And then we have pericardium again, and peritoneum. All of these have simple squamous epithelium. Now, I'm going to zoom into this image, and in this image I think I'm going to use this pen, in which you can see these arrows pointing at, very flat cells, right? You can see these cells are really, really flat. It's actually a blood vessel that has these really flat cells that you can see in this diagram. That's the endothelium of that blood vessel. This is probably an arteriole because of how thick it is. Arteries are slightly thick and they are slightly muscular, especially arterioles have a little bit of smooth muscle there. And this right here is probably a venule because of how thin it is, and it's got these red blood cells in them, if you can see. So this is probably a venule. And then moving on to this one. This one shows an image of actually any guesses? A part of the kidney nephron. The glomerulus, right? Glomerulus. The glomerulus actually has also lining it on the outside the simple squamous epithelium. And so that's these are the two examples of simple squamous epithelium, the blood vessel endothelium and the glomerular epithelium. Then we have also pleura, pericardium, peritoneum, not shown in the diagram. Next one, we have simple cuboidal. So this would be a single layer of cuboidal cells, usually present in ovary and thyroid gland. I have two images from the surface of the ovary, in which let's zoom into this. So here you can see that there's actually cells that we can actually identify. These are not very flat or flattened or so on, and not very difficult to see. These are easily seen, and they look even from all sides, right? Very even from all sides, not large columns, neither flattened. So these are simple cuboidal layer of cells found in the ovary. Here's another diagram of it. Here's the ovary again, and we have a simple cuboidal layer of epithelium on the ovary. These right here on the inside, these are follicles that are trying to mature. There's different types of follicles in the ovary, which are identified at their different basically stages, and you will learn all of that in maybe the second last chapter of the series. All right, before we move on, if you get a question in your university exam about maybe they ask about some examples of simple squamous epithelium, then you'd give them blood vessel endothelium and so on. Maybe there's an MCQ that says which of these has the simple squamous epithelium, then they give you a couple of options like ovary or stomach or intestines or blood vessels, and you say that simple squamous epithelium, which is the endothelium, is present in blood vessels, right? Similarly, if they asked you where the simple cuboidal epithelium is present, and that would be the ovary. Also, stratified cuboidal is also present in the ovary. So look at some of the images in just a bit. And then moving on to the next portion, which is going to be the simple columnar epithelium. This right here is a slide taken from the jejunum. So here's the portion of the jejunum, and when you zoom this in, so these are so many folds called villi, and then when you zoom this in, you get something like this, where you have this columnar layer of cells, simple columnar layer of cells, and on top of it, you can see a little border that's sticking out of the simple columnar epithelium. What is this border called again? We studied about it. It's called the brush border, or the striated border. And this border that is actually composed of microvilli. Microvilli cannot individually be seen in a microscope, but they appear as a brush or striated border. There's actually a disease that we studied related to it. It's called the celiac disease, which would damage the brush border due to gluten sensitivity. Okay, moving on. Stratified squamous keratinized epithelium. Now, this time we have stratified squamous. Now, stratified squamous epithelium can actually be of two types. It can either be keratinized or it can be non-keratinized. What is keratinized? What is non-keratinized? Well, keratinized stuff would have keratin in them. And what is keratin? Keratin is actually a protein. It is a protein that makes these epithelia very dry, scaly, hard, rigid. And so it would be found in areas that need to be hard, dry, and rigid. Like, for example, hair, right? Ever observe your hair? Hair are really dry and rigid. Similarly, nails. Nails are also quite hard and dry. And your skin, your external skin, is also waterproof and really dry. And it actually consists of stratified squamous layer of keratinized cells, which makes it really, really dry and waterproof and scaly. So here we have a diagram actually of the skin. This is what a skin would look like when we study the skin in the integumentary chapter, integumentary system chapter. What skin actually has is that it's got two layers. So we have the top layer, which is the epidermis, and it's the dermis. And over here we have the hypodermis. Don't need to be concerned with that one. This is the dermis. The epidermis consists of cells, as you can see here, while the dermis consists of connective tissue that you don't know about yet. We'll know about in the next chapter. And epidermis has obviously stratified layer of cells. These stratified keratinized squamous epithelium that you can see here on the very top is your skin. Now the way it forms is out of this this chapter's syllabus, so I'm not going to go into details of it. But this stratified squamous keratinized epithelium would not stain too well because it's actually made up of dead cells. The reason why they're dead is because they've lost all their organelles. So it would not stain too well, and their cells would not be very distinct. And so it appears something like this with H&E stain, right? That's stratified squamous keratinized epithelium, which is found, for example, in your hard, dry skin. Your skin, most of the external skin of the humans. Then we have stratified squamous non-keratinized epithelium. I said most areas or most skin because, for example, the skin of the vagina on the inside does not have keratinized, but rather has a very smooth non-keratinized epithelium, and so it would not be dry, but rather moist. And another example of this is the esophagus and the mouth. And here is a diagram, a slide of the esophagus, in which we can see that there's so many different layers of these flattened cells of the esophagus, right? And this is the stratified squamous non-keratinized epithelium that is present in the esophagus. Next up, we have stratified cuboidal, which would mean that it has more than one layer of cells that are even from all sides. And another example, an example of this is the ovary, like we discussed earlier, that simple and stratified both would be found on the epithelium of the ovary, and it's also present in the sweat gland. This is an example of a sweat gland right here, and look at different types of sweat glands in our body. Also sebaceous gland, you learn and you look at more slide images of these. But here you can see that there's actually, see, two epithelia, double cuboidal epithelium. And that is a stratified cuboidal epithelium, and it's part of your sweat gland. Next up, you have stratified columnar epithelium. This is actually quite a rare type of epithelium. It's not very abundantly present in the body. It's only present in the conjunctiva of the eye and the penile urethra as well. You know the penile urethra? There's the bulbourethral gland as well that actually secretes some mucus to reduce friction between movement of substances in the penile urethra. And then the penile urethra itself is lined by stratified columnar epithelium, which is quite a rare epithelium. It's only found in certain places in very small amounts. Conjunctiva of the eye also has that, and you can see it in this diagram that has more than one layer of columnar cells. Next up, we have pseudostratified columnar epithelium. We've already looked at it once. It appears as though it is stratified, but it's actually not. It's still columnar. And that's an example of this is the respiratory epithelium, and you can see it here. Now, this respiratory epithelium, again, has these cilia on top. These can easily be differentiated by how hair-like they appear on a microscopic slide as compared to just a border that would appear on for the microvilli. Now there's actually a clinical correlate to this, very important, is the metaplasia actually of this respiratory epithelium. What is metaplasia? Does anyone know? Metaplasia is a term that you learn especially in your first chapter of pathology. In pathology, the first chapter is usually the cellular injury, in which they teach you that one cell type can actually undergo a change to another cell type if a certain kind of stress is placed upon it. So switch of one cell type to another cell type, especially in epithelia, is metaplasia. And in this case, there's metaplasia of respiratory epithelium to squamous epithelium in chronic bronchitis, and people having, especially it occurs with the smokers, because due to smoking, there's continuous stress being placed upon the respiratory epithelium, and it results in metaplasia of respiratory epithelium and squamous epithelium. Continuous metaplasia can lead to neoplasia, which is sort of a precursor to cancer metastasis. This is reversible though. If you remove the stress, it is usually reversible. Then we have transitional epithelia. Again, like I discussed, there's different types of epithelia that would be present in a transitional epithelia. An example of this is the urinary tract, including the bladder epithelium. And here in this diagram, you can actually see that there's many different kinds of cells making this epithelium. And on the very top, we actually have these giant cells that are very, very pink cytoplasm. These giant cells are called actually umbrella cells. If you look at them later on in their own chapter as well, and these umbrella cells actually protect the urinary bladder and the urinary tract from the urine's harmful stuff. And that pretty much sums up our different kinds of epithelia and their microscopic slides. So last chapter regarding this is the glands, which I'm not going to go to in very much detail of it, because we look at different kinds of glands in your own chapters, like sweat glands, for example, and mammary glands, and so on. But here's a little introduction to these, is that there's 3 different kinds of glands. First of all, we have globate cells that we already looked at. They are mucus-secreting cells, usually found in respiratory epithelium and esophagus and so on. Then we have endocrine glands. What are endocrine glands? Might have studied these in physiology. Endocrine glands are actually those glands that secrete their secretions directly into blood so that it can be transported from blood. So, for example, there's endocrine hormones, and endocrine hormones would only travel through blood. There's different kinds of hormone signaling: paracrine, autocrine, endocrine. Endocrine would mean through blood. Endocrine glands would secrete things directly into blood. Similarly, we have exocrine glands. Exocrine glands secrete into ductal system. So, an example actually of this would be, for example, in the pancreatic duct, which then empties into the duodenum, carrying all of those pancreatic enzymes for digestion. Now, all those glands in the pancreas that secrete these digestive enzymes that ultimately go into the duodenum are traveling through a ductal system, through a duct into the duodenum, so that they're not entering blood at any point. And those are an example of exocrine glands, right? So I have some exocrine gland identifications here. First of all, there's simple ones, then the ones that are branched, and the ones that are coiled. So simple, branched, and coiled, and depending on their shape, they can either be acinar or they can be tubular, right? Like tubes in this case, or they can be like sacs, right? Sac-like secretory portions. And so if it is branched acinar, then it would be multiple sac-like secretory portions or parts, and so on. Now here's the important part. There's actually 3 different kinds of secretion methods. There's merocrine secretion, which actually means exocytosis, which basically translates as you have a cell and then something needs to be secreted. Like, for example, we have a vesicle that has been modified in the Golgi or something. It needs to be pushed out of the cell. What it would do is it would travel through some microtubules all the way to the cell surface membrane and fuse right here, and then when it fuses, it releases contents outside, and that's merocrine secretion. What is holocrine secretion? Holocrine secretion is when a cell would accumulate and burst, actually. So a cell would get bigger and bigger until it completely just bursts open and releases its contents. It results in the death of the cell, but a release of the contents that it's secreting. Example of this is the sebaceous glands in the skin, which we'll study later on. These are usually accumulated with hair follicles. And the last one are apocrine, which basically secrete part of the cell cytoplasm. So for example, if you have a cell and it becomes larger, and then when it needs to secrete a little bit, what it would do is it would exclude part of its cytoplasm as a secretion. This part of cytoplasm would go on as the secretion. And then there's also myoepithelial cells. These are not gland cells. These are usually present outside the glands, and they have characteristics of both muscles and epithelial cells. They are very flat, like this, and they are usually stained red, and they function. They're usually present outside the gland cells, and what they do is, so here we have a gland. Let's work with this one. So here we have this gland, which is an acinar gland, and we have some myoepithelial cell here. And if a stimulus comes to the myoepithelial cells to contract, because they are epithelial, and they also have this ability to contract because they also have the muscle function as well, then this contraction would result in pushing of the secretions into the duct and outside, right? So this is how myoepithelial cells assist in secretions of glands. We will look at many examples of myoepithelial cells, so I'm not going to show you any images of these as of right now. And that pretty much sums up our first chapter. So congratulations, guys, you finished the first chapter of the series, and I can't thank you enough for watching these videos. Remember, these diagrams that I've used, especially this diagram right here, is taken from Junqueira's book of Histology, and if you want to buy this book, you can use our link in the description. And these images that I've got, microscopic images, were taken from Histology Guide, a website, and we have permission to use both these diagrams from the book and these images from the authors themselves. So again, I thank you so much, and hopefully see you guys in the next chapter.